Okay, here we are at the partitioner, the tool for selecting and adjusting our disk partitions. We will first do an overview of the displays and controls of the partitioner. Then we'll cover how to select an existing partition to use for installing Ubuntu. Lastly, we will show how to add and delete disk partitions to get space for installing Ubuntu. At the top of the installer we have a graphical representation of the partitions on a disk drive. A sort of bar graph with color-coded segments representing the space consumed by each partition. Below the bar graph is the color code key with limited details about each partition. In this case we are seeing the partitions for the first drive identified by SDA. The SD prefix means a SCSI device. All hard drives, whether they are connected by SCSI, SATA, SAS, IDE, or USB, are universally handled as SCSI drives. Drives are identified by letters. The first drive is A, the second drive is B, the third drive is C, and so on. The partitions are numbered beginning with 1. The first partition of the first drive is SDA1. The second partition would be SDA2. We are shown under the bar graph that SDA1 is 23.6 gigabytes and has an ext4 type file system. The second partition is SDA2, which is 8.6 gigabyte and is of type Linux swap, a swap partition. The third partition is SDA5 and is 467.9 gigabytes with an ext4 file system. We covered file system types in a previous video. Below the graphical drive layout is a table that lists all of the drives and partitions. This table shows more details than the graphical layout. The table has 7 columns. Starting from the left, column 1 shows either a drive or partition device. All devices begin with a /dev path prefix. For Linux, all hardware devices can be accessed from the /dev or device directory of the root file system. We can select a drive, partition, or free space by clicking on it in this table. The selected item will be highlighted in orange. If we select a drive or partition on the /dev SDB drive, the second drive, the graphical layout would change to display details about SDB. Column 2 shows the file system type. Column 3 displays the mount point. The mount point is the directory where we would access a partition from. Since no partitions are mounted at this point, the column is empty. The fourth column is for format. There is a check mark here if we intend to format the partition. Column 5 gives the size in megabytes of the drive or partition. This is the total size of the drive or partition. Column 6 shows the amount of space used on the drive or partition, useful for determining if a partition contains data or is empty. For column 7, if a partition contains an operating system, the name and version of the operating system is listed. Note that if we have many drives and partitions, there will be a scroll bar at the right side of the table. We may need to scroll down to see the whole list. Below the table is a set of buttons that allows us to alter the partitions. At the left is the plus button. If we select an unallocated free space on a drive, we can use this button to add a new partition. We need sufficient free space to add a partition. The minus button is used to delete a selected partition. We select a partition in the table, then click this button to delete the partition. Handy for removing old partitions to make space for something new. But be warned, used wrong, we can lose data. When we select a partition and click the Change button, we can edit the partition. We will see how editing works shortly. The new partition table button is dangerous. Use with extreme caution. To use this button, we select a drive rather than a partition. Then click this button. This will delete all existing partitions on the drive and create a new empty partition table, essentially wiping the drive of all data. We would then need to add partitions for the drive to be useful. Any edits we make to partitions here are only proposed changes. Drives are not altered until we click the Install Now button to commit our changes and move on to the next step. In the meantime, we can use the Revert button to undo all of our proposed changes and return the partition layout to as it was before we entered the partitioner step. We can select where the bootstrap is put. Commonly, this is the master boot record or MBR of the first drive. If we have more than one drive, we can put the bootstrap on whichever drive we choose. A common scenario is to install Ubuntu alongside other operating systems such as Windows or OS X. The grub bootloader that Ubuntu uses will present a menu where we can select which operating system to boot. We might install Ubuntu on its own second drive separate from these OSs. We should then put the Linux bootstrap on the second drive. That way, from BIOS or UEFI, we can select the other drive and boot directly into the other operating system. Plus, the other operating systems tend to be rigid in where they put the bootstrap, and will likely overwrite our Ubuntu bootstrap if we put it on the first drive. There is also the option for installing a bootstrap to a partition within a drive rather than on the master boot record. This can be useful in a few instances. Unfortunately, most BIOSes don't know how to boot from a partition bootstrap. This will require another bootstrap installed to the master boot record that has the ability to boot from a bootstrap on a partition. This is commonly called chain loading because it requires several boot steps. At this point we would be done setting up partitions, except we haven't actually done that yet. If we had, we would then click on the Install Now button. This is the point of commitment to installing Ubuntu on a drive. Once we click this button, there is no going back. Before we proceed with the install, we should review our partitions, particularly the partition we selected to install Ubuntu on, and any partitions we may have altered. In short, are we in fact set up the way we think we should be? Double check that now. Triple check to be sure. If at all in doubt, click the Quit button now. Bail out of the installer before you damage anything that might exist on your computer. You do make backups, don't you? You do verify your backups, don't you? Here's a handy tip to help identify our disk drives when altering our partitions. At the bottom of the installer we have an area for selecting the drive where the bootstrap is installed. This provides us additional information about each disk drive in the computer. At the left is the device name. Here we see /dev/sta, which is the first drive in the computer. In the middle we see the manufacturer, in this case WDC or Western Digital Corporation. We also see the model WD500 AAKS-0. Then to the right we have the size of the drive. Here the size is 500.1 gigabytes. At the far right we see the little down arrow which allows us to select other drives. We get a drop-down menu that contains a list of all drives and their partitions. Using this information we can better identify drives. For example, in my computer I have a 320 gigabyte and a 500 gigabyte. From the information displayed here, I know the first drive is the 500 gigabyte and the second drive is the 320 gigabyte. Looking at the drive and partition table, we see the partitions for the first drive. Below that are listings for the partitions on the second drive. Since there are many partitions on that drive, I'd need to scroll down to see them all. The point is, we get many clues on what is where on the computer. Make use of all these clues. If you still are in doubt, do not blunder ahead. Blundering ahead will likely destroy other useful data on the computer. Be safe and click the Quit button now. Know which partitions you are installing Ubuntu on. Know if you are proposing to format other partitions, or altering them in any manner. Never assume, always know for sure.